Everyone, in this session I want to discuss the three different launching policies used with asynchronous function while we launch the background task to run in parallel with the foreground main thread. So I want to discuss those three launching policies in this session. Let me list it down here so that it's a bit more clear. The first one I want to discuss is the default policy. So when we use the asynchronous function to launch the background task to run parallelly, if we do not mention any launching policy within this parenthesis, then that is obviously the default policy. Okay, so the default policy, what happens here is whatever the background task, whatever the callable object we mention within this parenthesis, that callable object, that function may start execution in the background immediately, or the execution may get postponed. So that's what is meant by this default policy. Execution of the task in the background may start immediately or it may get postponed. So it purely depends upon the compiler and the OS and the availability of the thread actually. So here what happens, if the task has started immediately its execution in the background, the result will be obviously ready. So we can use the future object to call the get method, and we can collect the result, or if it is an exception we can collect the exception as well, right? So here get method we can call to collect the result of the background task. So in case if the background task has not started its execution, if it is postponed, then even then we can call the get method, so that at that particular line, when we call the get method, at that particular line the background task starts its execution. Okay, so that's the reason we recommend to use, or we recommend to invoke the get method while we asynchronously launch the execution of task in the background. The get method or wait method is recommended to just to collect the result, or whether it is an exception, how the programmer will come to know whether the background task has successfully run or successfully completed its task, or whether it has thrown some exception, right? So for that reason it's recommended to call the get method or wait method. Okay, so that's about default policy. So we are not sure whether the background task starts its execution immediately or it is postponed, right? So that's about the default policy. That's the first one. And then let me mention, is recommended to collect the result of background task. Okay, so the second method I want to discuss is the launch. That is the second policy, launch asynchronous. This policy I had already explained in my previous video session. So here what happens is the background task starts its execution immediately, as soon as at that very instant when we invoke the asynchronous when we call the asynchronous function and when we use this launch asynchronous policy, then that callable object, that function immediately starts execution in the background parallel to the foreground main thread. So immediately the task is running, so and in parallel with the main thread. So and the task may even get completed in the background. So we may not know. So how do we come to know? Obviously by calling the get method, right? So get method here, why do we use? To collect the result. The task is already has already been executed in the background, but here the main purpose of calling the get method is to collect the result of the background thread, collect the result or the exception, whatever result of the background threads. So that's the reason we invoke the get method here. And the third policy is launch deferred policy. Here what happens is, when the callable object is passed as a parameter to this asynchronous function, the callable object, the function doesn't get, doesn't start its execution immediately. It is the execution, rather it is postponed. How long it is postponed? Till the programmer invokes the get method or the wait method within the main thread, within the calling thread. Till then the task remains unexecuted. It's still in the background, but it has not started its execution. So if we do not call the get method, what happens? It's like zero execution. It's zero execution. So that's the reason you have to, it is mandatory to call the get method for whenever we use this launch deferred third, that is the third policy, right? So hope these three policies are clear. First one is the default, second one is launch asynchronous, third one is launch deferred. So in first one, what happens? We are not sure whether task is will execute immediately or whether it is postponed. So we can if it has started immediately its execution, then get will be used to collect the result only. In case if it has not started its execution, if it is postponed, then get method will be called to execute that background thread, and also to collect the result. So next policy, launch asynchronous. Launch asynchronous, what happens? The task already immediately starts its execution in the background, and get method, why do we use here? Only to collect the result of the background task. Result in the sense it may be the result or even exceptions, right? So then third policy is the launch deferred. Launch deferred is like a bit like a lazy execution, where the task will not be will not start its execution immediately, rather it is postponed. So how long it is postponed? Until and unless the programmer invokes the get method or the wait method. So wait methods I will be discussing in the future video sessions. So so in today's session I will stick on to the get method. So launch deferred policy, it postpones the execution and until and unless the programmer invokes the get method within the calling thread or the main thread, right? So get method becomes mandatory for launch deferred. So or else it becomes a zero execution. The background task doesn't execute, and it is zero execution. It's okay. So now let me start writing the program. So as usual, start with the header file, hash include IO stream, and then hash include since we are dealing with threads, so thread, and then hash include since we are dealing with asynchronous function, asynchronous way of launching the tasks. So we use the future objects here to call the get method. So future, we have to include this header file, and then since I want to induce some sleep sleep for functions, so for that purpose I want to include this header file chrono, right? So now I will first define a callable object, a simple function which is printing a string. Okay, printing a string in the sense any string. Okay, which is printing a string. Say let me name this function as task1, and the parameter, as I told you, I want to print a string. So okay, so now this is the function. So before that, let me use the namespace. Hope. Okay, so now, so within this callable object, I mean within this function, so what will I do? The first step, I want to print on the console the ID of this thread. Okay, so ID of this thread. So before that, let me mention what is the string, or what is the input string along with its ID. Okay, its thread ID is, so how do I print the thread ID? This thread, and we can invoke the get ID, right? So that's it. So before that, let me end the line. So this is how I print the thread ID with the input string. So then I want to induce some sleep for functions, so that this thread sleeps for a certain seconds. This thread and then sleep for how many seconds? Chrono. How many seconds? I would say 2 seconds. Okay, so done. So after this sleep function, what will be the return value of this callable object of this function? Some integer I want to return, say for example 40. Okay, done. Okay, so this will be the callable object, and then I will define the main method. So as usual, return 0. So within this main method, you can see it clearly. I want to call the asynchronous, and I will be using the 3 different launching policies. First one, asynchronous function. I'm calling the asynchronous function, and the first one is the default policy. So here it takes only 2 parameters. One is the name of the callable object. What is the name of the callable object? Task1, right? So that is our callable object, task1, and I want to pass one parameter, because as you can see it is it has one parameter, right? So that is string. So what string will I pass here? I want to mention that it is a default policy. It is asynchronous, but it is using default policy. How do I mention that? Default policy, just this way, so within double quotation. So this becomes one string. So function call, so this function call is a asynchronous function call, right? So that it launches the thread it launches the task to run in the background. So it will definitely return a future object. So future object, suppose let me name it as f1, And what will be the data type? I can mention it as standard future, but here I will just generally use it as auto, a simple way, where the compiler infers by itself the return type of the asynchronous function call is standard future, right? So the data type is inferred by the compiler here. So then after this I want to use the second launching policy. So what is that? Launch asynchronous. So I will call the asynchronous function, and here it takes 3 parameters. So launch, I have to mention the policy. First one, it was default policy. I did not mention any policy, so it has only 2 parameters. But here I have to mention the policy, which is that asynchronous policy, where the task is immediately launched for execution. So along with that, the second parameter will be the name of the callable object, that is task1. And once again, so the task1 has some parameters. We have to pass a string. So what shall I pass here? I will pass asynchronous. What type of policy it is? It is a launch asynchronous policy, right? Okay. So this is what I am passing as a string. Okay. So now once again I have to, the return type will be a future object. So I am generally using the keyword auto. The compiler will infer the data type. Okay. And then the third policy is the launch deferred. So I will invoke the asynchronous function. So here once again I have to mention the type of policy. It is launch deferred. So then I have to mention the name of the callable object task1, and then the parameter. So string, I have to pass a string as a input parameter. So I will give the string as launch. What is the name of the policy here? Launch deferred. So this would be the input string, right? So done. So what will be the return type? I am using the general keyword auto, and then F3. Sorry for, okay, the second one will be the F2, right? Okay. Okay, so now 3 functions. Oh, okay. Okay, 3 launching policies I have used, and I am invoking the asynchronous function, right? I am launching the task to run in the background parallel to the foreground main thread. So I am invoking the asynchronous with 3 different policies. Then what I have to do, as I told you, get method is mandatory for which policy? For launch deferred, isn't it? Or else it becomes 0 execution. So get method I will be invoking here. And then what about the second policy? Get method, is it mandatory? Not mandatory, but to see whether the task has been completed successfully or whether it has thrown some exception, we can call the get method for the second policy as well. And what about the first policy? We are not sure whether it is launched, whether the task has started execution immediately or postponed. So we either ways we invoke the get to, if it has started immediately the execution, get is meant for collecting the result. If it has not started the execution immediately, if it was postponed, then get is meant to start the background task, start the execution of the background task, right? So here the get method serves for 2 different purposes. Okay, this is for the first default policy. Okay, now before that I want to print the thread ID of the main thread. So how do I do that? I will copy this line. I will put it here. So I will remove this string. Okay. Okay, and then I will just mention it as main thread. Main thread ID is so and so. Okay, now, so now, as you can see, I'm returning returning an integer, right? So I also want to print the return value on the console. So let me put some cout statement. Okay. This is I will mention the policy. Okay, type of policy. This is launch deferred, and this is the get launch deferred, and we are invoking the get method. Let's see what it is, what result, I mean what was the return value of the background task, right? So similarly I want to print for the launch asynchronous policy. So what was the value returned by this method? By this method we will get to know. And similarly for the first policy, okay, this is default policy, right? Default policy. So done. Okay, now we get to know what are the return values from the three different policies respectively. Okay. Then what do I do? Shall I put on some sleep for function so that so that we can see some delay instead of rapid uh, statements printed on the console, we can see some delay. Let me put some sleep for functions in the main thread. Where shall I? Here. Okay. After invoking induce some delay and then print the return values. Fine, I guess this should be fine. Let us execute this. So before that I just wanted to mention something. Suppose say for second policy launch asynchronous, what happens, the background task is has started execution immediately, right? So the background task will always use a different thread for execution. So that's one more important point. Different thread, it always runs on a different thread. So but what about this launch deferred? It always runs on the main thread because of it is deferred, the execution is postponed. So the get method is called in the main thread. So the launch deferred policy will execute the background task in the main thread, just like a synchronous execution. Okay, so uses runs in the main thread. Oh, okay. Main thread. So what about the default policy? It depends whether it is whether the background task started immediately or postponed. If it is started, if it has started immediately, then it is a different thread by obviously. If it has postponed the execution, then the background task will be using the main thread for execution. Okay, it depends. Okay, here what shall I mention? Different thread or main thread. Okay, different thread or main. All right. Okay, fine. So now let me execute and see. Hope the concept is clear between I mean between these three different policies, launching policies of asynchronous threads. Now let me run. As you can see here, okay, so let me explain the output. First, the main function, when it starts its execution, the first statement what I'm doing is printing the main thread ID, right? So and hence here you can find the main thread ID is 14084. So then what am I doing? I am invoking asynchronous using default policy. So default policy, what happens, whether whether it has started immediately or postponed. How do I get to know? I have invoked the get within the main, right? So let us see the thread ID. Asynchronous default policy, its thread ID is 8612. So what does it mean? The thread ID is different from the main thread. So what does it mean? It means that the task was started uh, uh, its execution immediately, because the thread ID is different from the main. Okay. Next one, what am I doing? I'm calling the asynchronous launch asynchronous policy. So you can see asynchronous launch asynchronous policy. Its thread ID is once again it's a different ID. Obviously I told you for launch asynchronous always it is a different thread. So you can see the thread ID is 1280800. It is different from the main thread, right? Done. Then what is the third policy? Launch deferred. So it should always use the main thread ID, right? Okay, done. You can see the output here. Asynchronous launch deferred. Its thread ID is same as the main thread ID. So hence clearly it shows that launch deferred is running in main thread. So now the program has executed correctly. And what about the return values? You can see first I am calling the F3 get, launch deferred get, right? So launch deferred 40, and then F2 get, launch asynchronous 40, and then F1 get, default policy 40. So the return value is also correct here. I was returning 40 from the background task. So the integer is correctly collected in the main thread, and it's also printed on the console in sequence. So the program has executed correctly. So now if you want to see the clear, I mean, let me use endl so that it is printed line by line and the output statements are more clear on the console. Okay. Okay, where else shall I use endl? Okay, that's it. Okay, here let me put one slash and let me see so that the output statements appear clearer. Once again, let me run it again. Okay, now it is the statements are printed line by line. So main thread ID, as you can see, the first line in the main function is the main thread ID. I'm printing the main thread ID right here. So the first line is main thread ID is 23600. Then I'm invoking the default policy asynchronous. So the string is printed here. Okay, after printing the string, it's going to the next line and printing the thread ID. So it's a here the thread ID is different, though it is default policy. Yeah, the thread ID is different. So it means that the task had started its execution immediately. Then second policy, launch asynchronous policy, obviously it has a different thread ID from the main. And then the third one, launch deferred policy, it should have the same ID as main. Obviously it has the same ID here. 23600, right? So it has same as that of main. So the execution is correct once again, and then even the return value from the three times I had launched the background task, and in using three different policies. So first get method I used it. I invoked you call by using the future object of launch deferred policy, right? The third policy. So launch deferred, the return value is 40. Next I invoked using second policy, launch asynchronous 40. Then the last statement, I invoked the get using the default policy. So it is default policy 40. So this is how it's a simple program showing the difference between the three launching policies: default, launch asynchronous, and launch deferred. And this is how we can asynchronously run a task in the background, which means the task is parallelly running in background in parallel with the foreground main thread, right? So this is in C++. Hope you guys have understood. Any queries, let me know through comments. Okay, thank you so much.